All right, let's unpack this. We are diving into some really challenging, yet I think crucially important source material today. The core theme running through it is, well, it's provocative. It focuses on these seemingly endless, just grinding global conflicts. Gaza, Ukraine, Myanmar come up specifically. And the central question posed by this analysis, the thread connecting them, is this. What if the key to peace isn't actually achieving perfect justice or some kind of total military victory? What if instead it's about embracing something far less glorious? Something like radical pragmatism, maybe even settling for imperfect, messy political solutions.
That's a really powerful premise to start with. And what's striking, as you said, is the consistent thread the authors trace through these different conflicts. The argument keeps coming back to this. The
Yeah.
relentless pursuit of military victory, or maybe even a kind of utopian maximalist peace, it seems to only guarantee continued destruction, more suffering.
Right.
So yeah, the sources make a strong case for a fundamental shift, moving away from ideology, really, and moving towards a more realistic, often difficult political calculus.
Yeah.
A calculus of the possible, perhaps.
Exactly. And they contend, quite forcefully, that the traditional Western approach to conflict resolution, the one that's been dominant since, say, 1945, well, it's proving fundamentally inadequate. It just doesn't seem to fit the multipolar world we actually live in today.
Absolutely. This material suggests the world is maybe starving, is the word used, for just a glimpse of hope.
Hmm.
And that real statesmanship today might require less focus on military hardware and more on bold, maybe uncomfortable political imagination.
Uncomfortable is a good word for it.
So our mission in this deep dive is to really try and understand the mechanisms behind this perceived failure. We need to look at the argument that endless war maybe profits the few, the military-industrial complex gets mentioned explicitly, and then explore how a different playbook, one based on pragmatism, perhaps using something like the recent Gaza peace plan negotiations, however flawed, as a kind of template, how that might offer a way out for stalemates like the one in Ukraine.
It's a fascinating comparison. Setting Gaza alongside Ukraine, Myanmar, even Afghanistan, it forces you to look for those underlying patterns.
Okay, let's start right there with the Gaza peace plan. This analysis holds it up as, well, maybe an uncomfortable model, but potentially a highly effective one for practical conflict resolution. It's described explicitly in the sources as far from perfect, but that very imperfection is highlighted almost as its greatest strength. Can you unpack that a bit? How does deferring the big, maximalist, demand-like immediate statehood actually provide a strategic advantage in this view?
Well, the argument is that the strength comes precisely from strategically removing that ultimate political precondition, the long, elusive dream, as the source calls it, of a Palestinian state right now. The material really emphasizes that this question of statehood is deliberately, consciously deferred, pushed to a much later stage, assuming some stability can even be achieved first.
So it's a de-escalation move.
It's absolutely a political de-escalation. It's an acknowledgement, maybe a very painful one, that the current environment simply isn't ready. It can't sustain that kind of grand, highly polarizing solution right now. It's like trying to build the roof before the foundations are even laid. So the focus shifts necessarily to survival over ideology, at least for the moment.
Okay, so it forces everyone, or tries to force everyone, down from that ideological peak, gets them focused instead on the immediate humanitarian baseline. What does that pragmatism actually look like on the ground, according to this analysis?
It looks like focusing on immediate, achievable, and ideally less politically charged goals, things that directly impact human life. The sources detail the specific steps. First and foremost, ending the active hostilities, just stopping the shooting. Then, ensuring reliable, consistent humanitarian access, food, medicine, and shelter. After that, the really difficult part begins. Starting the process of disarming extremist factions, which is obviously hugely complex. And alongside that, laying the groundwork for just basic reconstruction, allowing people to rebuild something.
And the structure isn't built on, say, sudden trust between enemies.
No, not at all. The plan, as described, seems built not on trust, which is non-existent, but on verifiable steps, actions that demonstrably improve human lives right now, regardless of the long-term political outcome. It's about creating facts on the ground that aren't bullets and bombs.
And this structure, the goal is to provide what the material calls a truce, yes, but also more profoundly a breathing space. What does that mean in this context?
That breathing space is, well, it's everything for ordinary people caught in the middle. For the millions of Gazans mentioned, it's the chance to just stop running, to start rebuilding their homes, maybe restoring some basic dignity. The idea is to transform Gaza, even temporarily from what the source calls a perpetual war zone, into something resembling a functioning, even if incredibly fragile, society.
So the immediate goal is just cessation of suffering.
Precisely. Cessation of suffering and the restoration of some kind of basic civil order. The analysis argues these are the absolute necessary foundations. You can't build any meaningful long-term political stability on rubble and chaos. Without some minimal order, negotiation itself is impossible.
Now, a crucial element highlighted in the analysis regarding this specific Gaza plan's, let's say, limited success, was the mediation process itself. The sources give a lot of credit to Qatar and Egypt. Their involvement is seen as pivotal. The argument is the agreement gained credibility because it was negotiated by these regional intermediaries, not solely by Western powers. Why were they potentially so much more effective?
It boils down to credibility and leverage, really. Things that, frankly, the analysis suggests neither the Western powers nor Israel itself could really muster effectively in this specific context. Qatar and Egypt, they understand the local social fabric. They get the intricate family ties, the political networks, the really subtle undercurrents of power and influence that outsiders often miss or just disregard.
That deep, intrinsic local knowledge.
Exactly. And that knowledge grants them the essential leverage needed. It helps ensure that the local actors, the various factions on the ground, feel a degree of compulsion to comply, or at least see a benefit in complying with the agreement. It reframes the whole discussion. It's not about distant global power projection. It's about immediate regional, almost existential necessity for the neighbors. They have skin in the game in a different way.
So if we were to sum up this concept of imperfect peace, as presented through the Gaza example, its defining feature is this profound acknowledgement, maybe even acceptance, that perfect justice is impossible in the short term. Is that fair?
I think that's exactly it. The goal isn't ideological purity. It's not about achieving some utopian victory where one side gets everything it wants. The immediate goal, the only achievable goal perhaps, is simply stopping the violence, stopping the suffering, so that some kind of foundation for basic order can be established.
It sounds like an act of deep humility almost in international politics. A recognition that sometimes the only way forward is to agree on the bare minimum requirements for human life and security.
Yes, and consciously setting aside those maximalist political demands, the ones that are guaranteed roadblocks right now, until maybe, just maybe, a basic climate of trust, however thin, however fragile, can finally start to take hold. And the implication is clear. The rest of the world, especially places mired in these grinding, years-long stalemates, might need to consider adopting a similar kind of political humility.
Okay, let's immediately use that framework and contrast the pragmatism, however imperfect, of the Gaza approach with the situation in Ukraine. The material we're looking at describes the war there, starkly, as a grim stalemate, locked in these brutal cycles of destruction and defiance. Western support, of course, remains massive, arguably unprecedented. But the analysis suggests it's predicated on this continued belief, maybe hope, that outright military victory is achievable. Through sanctions, yes, but mainly through an ever-increasing supply of advanced weaponry, tanks, drones, missiles.
And this is precisely where the analysis delivers a really sharp, maybe uncomfortable critique of the prevailing Western strategy towards Ukraine. The heavy reliance on sanctions, on sophisticated hardware, while obviously impactful on the battlefield, is seen as rooted in what the source calls the illusion that sustained military force alone can ultimately compel a nation as vast and as centrally controlled as Russia to just capitulate entirely.
An illusion, that's strong language.
It is. The argument is that the situation in Ukraine has become structurally trapped. It's stuck. Precisely because the focus remains almost overwhelmingly military, on both sides really, but particularly from the perspective of Western support.
And within that, I think the recontextualization of sanctions is one of the most interesting and maybe controversial claims made here. The authors argue that sanctions in this context aren't really functioning as a political tool anymore. They describe them instead as, quote, a non-kinetic form of warfare, military strategy, essentially, dressed up in economic clothing.
That's a really potent analogy, isn't it? And the material tries to explain why this specific approach might be counterproductive in a conflict of this nature against this particular adversary. Sanctions fundamentally punish entire economies. They hurt ordinary people far more directly than they hurt the ruling elite, especially in a centralized, autocratic state. And crucially, they don't necessarily change the underlying ideology or the strategic calculations of the leadership.
So they don't soften the regime, they might even harden it.
That's the core argument. When directed at a state like Russia, the analysis contends sanctions tend to consolidate political power rather than fragment it. The government can control the narrative internally, blaming all the suffering squarely on foreign aggression. This tends to harden national resolve, or at least the appearance of it, and stiffen political resistance rather than weaken it, which, ironically, ends up prolonging the bloodshed.
And it pushes them towards self-sufficiency or alternative partners.
Exactly. It forces the sanctioned state further into developing its own domestic industries, or into the arms of alternative trade partners, China, Iran, North Korea, whoever is willing to deal. This makes surrender or compromise seem less necessary, not more likely, from Moscow's perspective.
Okay, and this perceived futility of sanctions, or at least their counterproductive nature in this view, feeds directly into the source's critique of the repeated attempts at a ceasefire-first approach in Ukraine. These attempts have been ongoing, largely unsuccessfully, for well over a year now. Why does a simple demand to just stop the fighting keep failing if the argument is that the war is already essentially a stalemate?
Because, the authors argue very directly, those attempts consistently duck the political questions at the heart of the conflict. They try to put a plaster on a gaping wound without addressing the underlying injury. They aim to stop the violence, sure, but without tackling the fundamental grievances, the territorial realities, the long-term security architecture concerns that actually triggered the war in the first place, and that keep fueling it.
So a pause isn't peace.
A temporary pause, in this view, isn't peace. It risks just becoming a refit period. A chance for both sides to rearm, regroup, and prepare for the next round of fighting, potentially even more fiercely. The required path, according to this deep dive, is actually the complete reverse of what's been tried so often. It's a full political package first, then a ceasefire.
Wow. Okay. So you actually have to negotiate the really hard stuff, the fundamental structure of future stability, including security guarantees for both sides, the status of disputed territories, language rights, all of it before the shooting is expected to stop permanently.
That's the argument. Otherwise, any ceasefire is almost guaranteed to be temporary. The conflict will just inevitably resume as soon as one side, or maybe both, feels it has recovered enough strength or sees a new opportunity.
Which means leaders have to engage in the really hard political work, the kind of compromises that are likely to be deeply unpopular at home.
Exactly. Instead of essentially outsourcing the solution to the generals in the battlefield, where victory seems increasingly elusive, leaders have to take ownership of the political concessions required. And that takes enormous political courage, maybe more than is currently visible.
And this leads us directly into what feels like the core of the analysis, because the material confronts why this crucial shift from prioritizing military solutions to embracing difficult political ones is apparently so globally challenging. It's the explicit invocation of President Dwight Eisenhower's famous warning about the military-industrial complex. The authors contend quite directly that the MIC actively traps conflicts like the one in Ukraine.
Yes, and this is where the critique becomes really fundamental, cutting across different political systems. It targets the core incentives that the analysis argues are driving, or at least prolonging, global conflict today. For the USMIC, the argument laid out is pretty straightforward, if stark. It thrives primarily, perhaps exclusively, in conflict or the credible threat of conflict.
Peace is bad for business.
Essentially, yes. Peace translates directly into shrinking profits. It means canceled long-term procurement contracts, maybe shuttered production lines for certain weapon systems, and, inevitably, waning political influence in Washington, D.C. Therefore, the argument goes, the powerful military lobby, consciously or unconsciously, prefers a state of endless war, or at least simmering managed conflict, to an imperfect, messy peace that actually ends the lucrative contracts and the demand for hardware.
And Ukraine, in this view, becomes almost the perfect scenario.
Tragically, yes. It becomes the ideal model, from this perspective, for sustained, high-intensity, high-tech, and therefore highly profitable attrition warfare, consuming vast amounts of ammunition, drones, sophisticated systems that need constant replacement and upgrading.
But the analysis is very keen to point out, and this is important for balance, that this is absolutely not presented as exclusively a Western issue. They describe the Russian MIC as potentially even more insidious. Why insidious?
Well, the argument is that Russia's entire national economy leans so profoundly on just two main pillars: hydrocarbons, oil and gas, and arms sales. Without the immense internal demand created by a sustained, large-scale war effort, and without the ability to sell its military hardware globally, often to regimes shunned by the West, the whole Russian economic engine begins to sputter. War becomes almost structurally necessary.
So for the Kremlin and the oligarchs connected to that system, Conflict isn't just policy, it's economic survival.
That's the implication drawn in the analysis.
Yeah.
Therefore, the danger described is acute. Ukraine risks becoming locked in as a perpetual battlefield, a tragic stage where both global power structures, East and West, pursue their own intertwined goals of profit and geopolitical dominance narratives. And Ukraine, the country and its people, gets trapped between these two enormous complex structures, both of which, in different ways, are seen as economically or politically dependent on its continued instability.
That completely reframes the conflict, doesn't it? It suggests the actual needs and desires of the Ukrainian people for peace and reconstruction might become fundamentally secondary to the financial and political imperatives of these global military industries on both sides.
It's a deeply cynical view, perhaps, but one that sources put forward very strongly. And to illustrate this point, the necessity of prioritizing politics over purely military solutions, especially when MIC interests are involved. The authors cite a specific historical example, the Nepal Civil War, around 2005-2006.
Okay, Nepal. What's the specific takeaway from that conflict that applies here?
During that brutal civil war between the government and Maoist rebels, the analysis notes that the United States, consistent with its approach elsewhere, was very keen to flood the government with weapons. The goal was clear: achieve a decisive military victory over the Maoists.
But it didn't work.
It proved completely impossible. The military solution simply wasn't achievable on the ground, despite the external support. Peace, when it finally came, was achieved only when both sides, the government and the rebels, were forced to recognize the absolute futility of seeking a military knockout. They had to consciously turn away from the battlefield and finally embrace politics, hammering out a new, difficult political consensus that involved power sharing and constitutional changes.
And the analogy to Ukraine is?
The analogy drawn is pretty clear. If a decisive battlefield victory for either side in Ukraine were truly possible or seen as imminent, the necessary weapons and support to achieve it would likely have already been supplied without hesitation by their respective backers. The current reality, the grinding stalemate the analysis suggests, is perhaps the ultimate signal of military futility. It's a sign that the solution lies elsewhere in the political realm, however difficult that may be.
This analysis, logically then, leads into what is probably the most controversial section, a direct and quite pointed critique of Ukrainian President Zelensky's leadership during this phase of the war. The source material poses a really challenging question. Is Zelensky, who's so successfully transitioned quite remarkably from comedian to wartime statesman, is he now, in their words, still playing the clown? Is he perceived as refusing to use the political, diplomatic moves potentially available to him and instead focusing primarily on maintaining morale through defiance and these high-profile applause tours across Western capitals?
It is indeed a very harsh assessment, maybe even unfair, some would say. But the stated purpose within the analysis seems less about personal criticism and more about highlighting the political options that the authors argue must be pursued if there's to be any realistic chance of achieving a lasting peace. They contend that Zelensky holds powerful political cards, his immense domestic and international legitimacy, his popular support, but that he's choosing, for understandable reasons perhaps, not to deploy them fully for political compromise, preferring instead the narrative of unwavering resistance until total victory.
Okay. So the sources then present a very specific, sequential, 6-point political package. They call it a potential peace roadmap. And they argue this package, or something very much like it, must form the core of any lasting settlement. Let's dedicate some real time to unpacking these 6 steps, because they are, frankly, radical. They challenge core assumptions held not just by Kyiv, but by many of its Western allies too. Step 1 is fundamental: seek a new mandate.
This is presented as a profound political maneuver. The argument is that Zelensky must commit to holding national elections. This is seen as a necessary democratic step anyway, which obviously requires a period of relative peace, or at least a stable ceasefire, to even be feasible. His first public pledge, the source suggests, should be something like, "I need peace in order to seek a new mandate from the Ukrainian people." This reframes the entire situation.
How so?
It uses his massive existing political legitimacy not just to prosecute the war, but as direct leverage to drive the peace process forward. It signals that peace is the prerequisite for resuming normal democratic life. Of course, the domestic political cost of this is potentially huge. Wartime leaders often fear elections, seeing them as divisive or a sign of weakness. But the analysis argues that democratic legitimacy gained from this commitment would be invaluable for the incredibly difficult negotiations that must follow.
Okay, that's step 1. Step 2 is perhaps the most constitutionally explosive proposal here: delete the NATO clause.
Yes. The material views Ukraine's constitutional goal of eventual NATO membership, while perfectly understandable from Kyiv's perspective, as a persistent, low-grade, but significant provocation towards Moscow. It's seen as something that doesn't actually grant Ukraine any concrete security guarantees or membership rights now, but which effectively guarantees ongoing conflict by feeding into Russia's stated security concerns, however genuine or pretextual those might be.
So deleting it is a concession.
Deleting it now, the argument goes, wouldn't necessarily preclude membership forever if the entire geopolitical consensus shifted dramatically later on. But deleting it today would serve as a crucial, tangible, and relatively low-cost gesture of peace towards Russia. It removes one of Moscow's primary stated justifications for the conflict, potentially at almost zero practical cost to Ukraine's actual security situation in the immediate short term, since membership isn't on the table anyway.
That's a tough sell politically, I imagine.
Extremely tough. Let's move to internal reform. Step 3 proposes to federalize Ukraine. This step aims to address the deep-seated regional and demographic realities within Ukraine, many of which predate not just the 2022 invasion, but even the 2014 events. Federalization, in this context, means granting significant, constitutionally protected autonomy to all regions, not just the eastern ones currently disputed. It implies a much more decentralized state structure.
And language rights are key here?
Critically, yes. The proposal includes making Russian an official second language of government administration throughout the country, reflecting the demographic reality on the ground, particularly in the south and east, but potentially nationally. The goal is to guarantee language and cultural rights explicitly, which is seen as essential for long-term internal stability and removing any potential pretext for future foreign intervention based on defending ethnic or linguistic identity. But again, the political challenge of implementing this, especially during or immediately after a war fought largely on nationalist grounds, is immense. It cuts against the grain of wartime national consolidation.
Okay, step 4 tackles the absolute hottest point of contention, the status of the disputed territories, including Crimea. The source proposes UN-supervised referenda.
Yes, and the proposal here is highly specific, aiming for legitimacy. It suggests that citizens residing in Crimea and the other currently contested regions must be offered 3 clear, distinct options in internationally monitored votes. Option 1, remain within a newly federalized Ukraine, with their autonomy and rights explicitly guaranteed under the new constitution. Option 2, become fully independent states, recognized internationally. Option 3, join the Russian Federation.
And the UN supervision is non-negotiable.
Absolutely critical. The legitimacy of this entire painful process hinges on these referenda being genuinely free, fair, and transparently supervised by the United Nations, or a similarly credible international body. This is presented as the only way to potentially establish future sovereignty based on something resembling international law and local consent, rather than the current unilateral, unrecognized claims established by force.
Following that highly sensitive step comes step 5, focused on immediate security on the ground and allowing people to return home. Invite UN peacekeepers.
This is framed as the essential mechanism for de-escalation and stabilization after a political agreement is reached. It would require both Russian and Ukrainian forces to pull back significantly, not just from the immediate line of contact, but establishing a deep, demilitarized buffer zone, the source suggests perhaps 50 miles wide, along the entire conflict front.
50 miles, that's substantial.
It's very substantial. Into this wide zone, a robust force of UN peacekeepers would deploy. Their mandate would be not just to monitor the ceasefire, but to maintain basic order, prevent incursions, and crucially, facilitate the safe and orderly return of the millions of refugees and internally displaced people who've lost their homes and livelihoods. Rebuilding trust starts with physical security.
And finally, step 6 provides the carrot or the incentivizing mechanism, particularly for Russia. Link sanctions relief directly to progress.
Right. The current blanket sanctions regime, which we discussed earlier as functioning essentially as economic warfare, must be transformed, according to this analysis, into a precise, calibrated tool for peace implementation. Sanctions should be lifted incrementally, step by step, and this lifting must be aligned directly and verifiably with Russia's compliance on specific agreed-upon actions, implementing the ceasefire, respecting the referenda results, whatever they may be, withdrawing troops to agreed lines, and adhering to the overall political package.
So it creates tangible benefits for compliance.
Exactly. It creates genuine, immediate economic incentives for Moscow to actually respect and implement the diplomatic process, rather than simply enduring endless economic attrition while trying to win on the battlefield. It turns sanctions from a blunt weapon into a potential diplomatic tool.
So putting it all together, The analysis's final judgment on Zelensky, based on whether he pursues such a path, is presented as a stark, direct challenge to his current wartime leadership image.
It really is. The framing is. If he takes these kinds of bold, politically risky steps, he moves Ukraine and himself beyond destruction and toward dignity. He could, they suggest, potentially earn a Nobel Peace Prize for achieving a difficult but lasting peace. However, if he refuses this path, perhaps prioritizing continued Western military support and the goal of total victory, the source contends, quite harshly, that he risks remaining the clown in office, a leader unable to make the transition from wartime defiance to the even harder task of political peacemaking.
It's clearly designed to provoke, to shock the system maybe, to force a conversation about the ultimate costs of war. Is achieving maximum military goals worth the potential complete destruction of the nation?
Or does political survival, the survival of the state itself, eventually have to yield to the necessity of finding a stable long-term security arrangement, even one that involves deeply painful compromises? It poses the question of whether immense personal courage is required not just to fight, but to sacrifice wartime popularity for the deeply unpopular political deals that might be necessary for lasting peace.
Now, if we broaden the lens again, this critique of the specific stalemates in places like Ukraine seems to be part of a wider critique. It's aimed at the entire global conflict resolution framework, the one that's largely been in place since World War II. The authors state quite explicitly that this traditionally Western-led framework is, in their view, losing legitimacy in much of the world.
Yes, and that's a really significant claim. It suggests the geopolitical landscape has shifted, maybe irreversibly. The old powers, the US and Europe primarily, are perceived by large parts of the global South, rightly or wrongly, as being biased, perhaps having too much historical baggage, or in some cases, simply being ineffective in resolving conflicts where their direct interests aren't paramount.
So the problem needs reframing.
The analysis argues strongly that the problem needs to be reframed. It's not just a battlefield contest between two sides or their proxies anymore. It's often a far more complex geopolitical puzzle, involving multiple regional and global players with competing interests. And the conclusion drawn is that for any enduring peace to take hold in places like Ukraine or potentially Myanmar, the world requires new, credible mediators. Crucially, mediators who aren't perceived as being ideologically aligned with either side of the primary NATO-Russia confrontation.
And the authors don't just leave it there. They point directly to two specific nations, India and China, calling them two civilizational powers. Why are they seen as essential new mediators in this specific moment, according to the analysis?
It boils down to their unique positioning, their deep, complex, and often non-aligned historical ties to both Russia and key players in the global South. This gives them a potential balance, maybe a moral weight, or perhaps just hard-nosed strategic leverage that Western nations currently lack in dealing with Moscow. India, for instance, with its long-cherished tradition of non-alignment and its generally positive relationships across different ideological divides, it's seen as potentially able to act as a genuine bridge, a relatively neutral arbiter between the West and Eurasia, whose motives might be perceived as less purely self-interested or aligned with one bloc.
And China obviously brings something different to the table, immense strategic clout.
Absolutely. China's influence is undeniable. It's driven by its massive Belt and Road Initiative interests, which require regional stability, and also by a growing diplomatic assertiveness on the world stage. The argument is that if achieving peace in Ukraine aligns with China's broader strategic goals, ensuring stability for trade routes, enhancing its global standing, then Beijing possesses the necessary economic and political influence to potentially push Moscow towards compromise in a way that perhaps no NATO nation currently can, simply due to their profound economic interdependence and shared geopolitical outlook vis-à-vis the West.
So the source goes further and actually proposes a specific new potential architecture for mediation, a trilateral peace initiative involving India, China, and maybe, interestingly, a neutral European state like Switzerland. What would be the overarching objective of a new grouping like that?
The ultimate goal described is to fundamentally shift the entire discourse, to move it away from the current zero-sum game of winning or losing, which seems to guarantee perpetual conflict. Instead, the focus would be on designing a comprehensive regional security architecture, one that explicitly tries to accommodate the legitimate security concerns of all the key stakeholders.
All stakeholders, so that includes.
It would have to simultaneously address NATO's concerns about stability on its eastern flank, Ukraine's absolute and non-negotiable need for sovereignty and long-term security guarantees, and somehow acknowledge and manage Russia's stated sense of strategic dignity regarding its borders and influence in its near abroad. It's an incredibly ambitious goal. It attempts to define peace not through the military dominance of one side, but through shared, mutually acceptable security arrangements. A move from confrontation to coexistence, however uneasy.
Okay, let's shift our focus now, using this lens of complex conflicts and external influence, to perhaps the most intricate and, according to this analysis, tragically overlooked conflict: Myanmar, also known as Burma. The source uses a shocking label. It calls Myanmar the world's deadliest proxy conflict. Now that's an extraordinary claim, isn't it? Especially given the sheer scale and intensity of fighting we see in places like Ukraine or Yemen or parts of Africa. We really need the detail to understand that deadliest claim.
The justification provided rests on a combination of factors. The sheer depth and complexity of the fragmentation on the ground, the almost unimaginable duration of the violence, and the way multiple layers of conflict overlap and intensify each other. The analysis identifies three devastating interlocking layers that make Myanmar unique in its deadliness. First, you have the world's longest-running civil war. It's been going on in some form for over 77 years, and it dramatically intensified after the military coup in 2021. Second, you have deep-seated regional rivalries playing out. And third, overlaying all of that, you have intense global power competition.
And the civilian suffering is the key metric for deadliest.
Yes, ultimately, the human cost is what makes that claim stick, according to the source. We're talking about maximum fragmentation on the battlefield. Not just one or two rebel groups, but literally dozens of distinct ethnic armed organizations. The EAOs like the Karen, the Kachin, the Shan, Arakan Army, many others, each controlling territory, each with their own history and objectives.
And then you have the pro-democracy forces that emerge after the coup.
Exactly. Layered on top of the ethnic conflicts, you have the forces aligned with the ousted civilian government. The primary political wing is the NUG, the National Unity Government. They aim to be the legitimate, internationally recognized government. Their armed wings and numerous local, often loosely affiliated resistance groups that sprang up across the country are generally known as the PDFs, the People's Defense Forces. This extreme fragmentation means there's no single opposition to negotiate with, no single front line. It guarantees chaos and makes any kind of centralized peace process almost impossible.
And the humanitarian toll resulting from this chaos is described as absolutely staggering.
It is. The analysis puts it on a scale comparable to the horrors seen in Syria or Sudan, not just in the sheer numbers millions displaced internally and externally, but in the systematic nature of the violence inflicted, particularly by the military junta, the Tatmadaw. Since the 2021 coup, tens of thousands of civilian deaths have been documented. The Tatmadaw has systematically used airstrikes, often with jets reportedly supplied by Russia, against civilian areas hitting schools, monasteries, hospitals, IDP camps. It's described as terror tactics.
And food being used as a weapon.
Crucially, yes. The military is accused of deliberately disrupting food supply lines and agricultural activities in areas controlled or contested by opposition forces, blocking aid convoys. This weaponization of food creates immense, potentially catastrophic famine risks in large parts of the country.
Yet, despite all of this, the duration, the fragmentation, the immense human suffering, the source makes a really striking point. This conflict receives arguably the least international media coverage compared to other major wars like Syria, Ukraine, or Yemen. Why is that, do they suggest?
The analysis doesn't fully explain the lack of coverage, but implies it's due to the complexity, the remoteness for Western audiences, maybe the lack of a clear good versus evil narrative that fits easily into headlines, and the difficulty for journalists to even access the conflict zone safely. But let's look at why it's structurally defined as a proxy war. Who are the external players entangled, and how? It's a complex web. Regional and global powers are deeply involved, often playing multiple sides. China is a major player. It provides support to various ethnic armed groups along its border, maintaining influence in buffer zones. But simultaneously, Beijing maintains extensive economic and diplomatic ties with the ruling junta, the Tatmadaw, primarily to protect its vital strategic interests, oil and gas pipelines that run through Myanmar to the Chinese coast, crucial trade routes, and overall regional stability on its southern flank.
So China plays both sides.
It appears so, hedging its bets. India, similarly, is described as hedging. It generally supports the junta for pragmatic reasons, needing cooperation on border security to manage insurgencies in its own northeast. But Delhi also maintains some low-level contact with opposition actors, trying to keep its options open and counterbalance Chinese influence.
And then the more global powers, the U.S., Russia.
Here the lines are a bit clearer, resembling more classic proxy dynamics. Russia is a key military supplier to the junta. It provides sophisticated hardware fighter jets, helicopters, armored vehicles reportedly in exchange for diplomatic alignment on the world stage, and, of course, lucrative arms sales revenue. Russia sees the junta as a reliable anti-Western partner. Meanwhile, the USA and the European Union rhetorically back the NUG and the pro-democracy movement. They impose sanctions on the junta and its business interests, provide non-lethal assistance to some groups, and advocate for democracy.
So you get this deadlock at the international level.
Exactly. A perfect diplomatic and military stalemate often seen in proxy wars. China and Russia use their veto power, or threat of it, at the UN Security Council to shield the junta from stronger international action like arms embargoes. Meanwhile, the West applies sanctions and provides moral support, but perhaps lacks the leverage or the will for deeper intervention. The result? Total military entrenchment on the ground with no clear path to resolution while the country burns.
And what really deepens the instability, making this war almost self-sustaining, is the powerful link identified in the sources to the criminal economy. The analysis points out that large parts of the war are effectively financed by vast global crime networks.
This is arguably the most shocking and intractable aspect that allows the conflict to continue indefinitely, regardless of political shifts. Myanmar is identified quite starkly as the world's largest source of synthetic drugs, particularly methamphetamine, and also a major producer of heroin. These drug empires are often run by, or in partnership with, various warlords, militias, and even elements within the military and border guard forces, particularly in the fractured, semi-autonomous border regions like Shan State.
And it's not just drugs.
Not just drugs. Beyond narcotics, various armed groups, including the junta and ethnic armies, fund themselves through the illicit extraction and smuggling of natural resources, particularly jade, rubies, and timber, often feeding into Chinese markets. And more recently, there's been an explosion of massive cyber fraud operations based in these lawless border zones, often using trafficked labor to scam victims across Asia and globally. This vast criminal economy ensures that the violence isn't just geopolitical, it's immensely profitable for key actors on all sides. It provides warlords and proxy groups the independent financial capacity to continue fighting long after any original political grievances might have faded or become negotiable. Peace would disrupt these lucrative illicit businesses.
All right, let's transition now using this framework of external influence, governance failure, and the consequences of ignoring local realities. Let's turn to a crucial historical case study presented in the sources, Afghanistan, famously, tragically, known as the graveyard of empires. After looking at the extreme fragmentation and the failure of imposed models in Myanmar, the question posed about Afghanistan is fundamental. Why does this land, this society, seem to consistently defeat or outlast powerful foreign invaders? And what was the core fundamental error, according to this analysis, in the two-decade Western attempt to build a stable nation there?
The historical pattern presented is just relentless, isn't it? It spans centuries. The sources explicitly recall the catastrophic British retreat from Kabul in 1842, where out of some 16,000 soldiers and civilian followers, famously, only one British doctor supposedly survived to tell the tale. Then the Soviets in the 1980s, bogged down in a decade-long war they couldn't win, and of course the Americans and their allies after 2001. The analysis argues that the land, the society, ultimately defeats the empire, not necessarily through conventional military prowess, but through sheer, almost geological, generational patience and resilience.
And the resistance isn't just military?
No. The sources stress it's rooted much deeper. It's described as a profound spiritual and civilizational sense of sovereignty, an absolute rejection of foreign domination that invaders consistently misunderstand. They mistake the resistance for mere military incompetence or tribal disorganization, failing to grasp the underlying unity in rejecting outsiders.
And the source claims the fundamental error, the root cause of the U.S.-led intervention's ultimate failure, stemmed from what it calls the arrogance of imported democracy. Is that the core argument?
That seems to be the central thesis. America and its allies fundamentally failed, the analysis argues, to see Afghanistan not as a single nation-state in the Western sense, but as a complex tapestry of interconnected nations, or QAMs, intricate, interlocking tribal, ethnic, and regional structures with their own deep histories and forms of local governance. Instead, Washington often dismissed these complex realities, labeling them simplistically as primitive tribes.
And this misapprehension led to the wrong model being imposed.
Exactly. The U.S. mistook democracy for simply imposing its own preferred form of rule. Instead of patiently nurturing an Afghan democracy, one rooted in existing local customs, traditions like the Loya Jirga, and decentralized legitimacy. Washington tried to export its own highly centralized model wholesale. They pushed for a massive, powerful presidential system based in Kabul, elections overseen by foreigners, Western-style bureaucratic institutions, a national army built in the American image. The analysis argues this entire political structure was essentially an alien transplant that the Afghan social body consistently and ultimately violently rejected because it concentrated power too far from the local tribes and communities where real authority and legitimacy actually resided.
So what was the missed blueprint? If the centralized model was wrong, what could have potentially worked, according to this analysis? They suggest a specific alternative, a layered system, a kind of tribal federation.
Yes. The argument is that this alternative model could have achieved genuine self-rule, rooted in local legitimacy, which might have been more resilient. The proposal envisioned a system where each major tribal region or province would elect its own local leaders, perhaps using traditional methods or local councils, not necessarily Western-style ballots everywhere initially. These recognized local leaders would then form a grand council, a national loya jirga, essentially institutionalized, and that body, representing the diverse regions and tribes, would in turn elect a national president or leadership council.
So power flows upwards, not downwards.
Precisely. The power structure would flow up from the provinces and tribes to the center, not down from an isolated Kabul elite to the periphery. The source even notes the deep irony here. This proposed layered, decentralized system, emphasizing local consent, building towards federal unity. It actually mirrors the original philosophical intent behind the U.S. Electoral College system. But the U.S. failed in this view to recognize its own historical blueprint reflected in Afghan tribal reality.
It's a fascinating point. So why then, if this more organic, potentially more stable, locally legitimate model was conceivable, why did it fail to materialize during the long U.S.-led intervention? Why the insistence on the centralized model?
The authors offer a pretty blunt and deeply critical explanation. They state it very directly. A slow, organic democracy does not feed the military-industrial complex.
Back to the MIC.
Back to the MIC. The argument is that the profitable approach for Western governments, contractors, and consultants was effectively to wipe the existing slate clean, ignore the complex local structures, and rebuild Afghanistan from the ground up using massive, centrally managed, high-value contracts. Building new ministries, training a national army from scratch, hiring legions of expensive international advisors, billing astronomical hours. This created a system of profound dependency on American funding and oversight rather than fostering genuine partnership and Afghan self-sufficiency. It prioritized measurable inputs, dollars spent, advisors deployed, over sustainable outcomes.
And this connects to how the Taliban were handled. The sources also argue that the whole approach to the Taliban movement itself was fundamentally flawed from early on. Instead of pursuing a strategy of eradication, hunting them to extinction, they should have been assimilated somehow.
Yes, the analysis suggests a policy of integration, especially in the early years after 2001 when the Taliban were defeated but not destroyed. Perhaps incorporating former rank-and-file fighters or even mid-level commanders who weren't hardcore ideologues into the new Afghan security structures. Maybe as local police forces under traditional community control, or as provincial guard units, or even integrating acceptable elements into the national army, leveraging existing loyalties rather than creating new enemies. The argument is that dialogue and integration, however difficult, should have trumped eradication from the start.
And they draw parallels to make this point.
They draw a really powerful, if perhaps controversial, parallel to the formation of the State of Israel, pointing out that Israel's founders had to unify several competing, often violently hostile pre-state armed Jewish groups, the Haganah, the more extreme Irgun, the Lehi, through intense political negotiation and sheer necessity, forging them into a unified Israel Defense Forces, IDF. By contrast, the U.S.-led approach in Afghanistan often seemed designed to create and perpetuate an enemy, the Taliban insurgency, rather than seeking potential pathways, however narrow, to incorporate reconcilable elements into a new national consensus.
And they contrast the U.S. approach with India's engagement in Afghanistan during that period. India's approach is held up as a more respectful and ultimately more effective model.
Yes, India's role is highlighted as an example of a different way. India engaged Afghan officials across various governments largely as equals. It invested in visible, dignity-affirming projects, things like building roads, schools, hospitals, even the new parliament building. The focus was on cultural ties, infrastructure, capacity building, not creating dependency or imposing a specific political model. The implication is that America perhaps spoke too much and listened too little. It was too focused on imposing its own ideals and systems, rather than patiently cultivating solutions rooted in Afghan realities.
And this misunderstanding comes back to that idea of Afghan resilience.
Exactly. The material suggests that foreign invaders consistently mistake Afghan simplicity, the austere lifestyle, the lack of complex infrastructure in many areas for backwardness or weakness. But the analysis argues this very hardship, the ability to survive on very little, is actually their armor, their strength. Afghans measure power not necessarily in GDP or advanced weapon systems, but in endurance, honor, faith, and loyalty to their community and traditions. And the ultimate humbling truth underscored by the sources is this: invaders count years, maybe decades. Afghans count generations. The land, the society, the culture. It ultimately defeats empires through infinite patience and an unbreakable connection to place. Hashtag tag tag outro one.
So, after diving deep into these complex situations, Gaza, Ukraine, Myanmar, Afghanistan, what's the big picture takeaway? What does this all mean for us trying to understand conflict today? The common thread running through all this analysis seems to be a deep, profound skepticism of purely military solutions and maybe even purely ideological ones. There's a consistent call for embracing difficult, messy, and negotiated political packages.
That's right. Packages that genuinely try to address local realities, local grievances, local power structures, not just impose external templates.
And packages that also seem to require consciously incorporating new global players. The analysis points strongly to regional actors like Qatar and Egypt in the Middle East, and potentially global players like India and China in resolving wider Eurasian conflicts.
It really challenges the idea of a single dominant model for peacemaking.
And ultimately, it keeps coming back to this idea that imperfect peace, a peace that accepts ambiguity and doesn't achieve everything for everyone immediately. That might be the only viable, the only humane path forward when you're facing these kinds of deeply entrenched, complex conflicts.
And digging into that, I think it raises a really important, maybe uncomfortable question that resonates across all these cases. The authors make the same fundamental critique, whether explicitly or implicitly, in every single theater we've discussed, that the interests of the military-industrial complex, both East and West, and the persistent search for total victory, whether that's military victory on the battlefield or the complete ideological capitulation of the opponent, that these forces actively, structurally undermine the potential for realistic, sustainable peace.
So the real challenge isn't necessarily finding the perfect peace plan on paper.
Perhaps not. The real challenge, this analysis suggests, is whether global leaders on all sides possess the necessary political courage, the strategic foresight, and maybe most importantly, the basic human humility. The humility to choose a path that might be less profitable for certain powerful interests, less glorious in terms of national narratives, but ultimately far more humane. A form of conflict resolution that genuinely prioritizes long-term political dignity and stability over the allure of short-term military dominance or ideological purity.
Which leaves us with a final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider. If the world's most powerful nations, regardless of their political system, continue primarily to export their own specific, often rigid models of centralized governance and top-down conflict resolution, the Washington model, the Moscow model, the Beijing model, how many more Afghanistans, how many more Syrias or Ukraines or Myanmars, how many more graveyards of empires or zones of perpetual conflict must they encounter before realizing, perhaps, that true, enduring global influence and power might lie less in lecturing the world on ideals and more in the difficult, patient work of actually listening. Listening carefully to local realities, respecting the inherent sovereignty and dignity of diverse peoples, and facilitating peace from the ground up, not imposing it from the top down.